So as I told you a few days ago, I've been working on a big project for Smite. And this project has been looking through all the past patch notes, patch logs, updates, whatever you want to call them, to see what changes which guards received. And this included all the tweaks, all the buffs, all the nerfs, all the reclasses, and the total number of changes resulting out of that. Why did I do that? To make videos exactly like this one. Today we're talking about the most nerfed guards in Smite. There are some things that I did not count for these nerfs. Things that happened before Season 1, because in the beta and alpha the patch structure was very different and changes were done rapidly basically, with very small changes with every single patch. Also things that were just quality of life changes, also things like camera height adjustments, and everything else surrounding changes that aren't directly impacting the guard's performance. What I however did include were smaller changes to the guard as well, for example something like mana cost. Nothing major, but it can be impactful. See for example Sobek, who had his mana cost reduced and then spiked up in popularity, as his mana cost before was simply ridiculous and outdated. A change that had both buffs and nerfs to a character was generally considered a tweak, unless one of the two was completely overwhelming the other, a heavy nerf with a very small buff or a heavy buff with a very small nerf. Also a quick disclaimer before I get started, given the massive amount of information that I went through, I may have overlooked one buff or one nerf. I didn't find a single one even after checking everything so far for these guards, but maybe there's another guard that actually got more nerfs and I didn't actually notice it, but I'm fairly certain this list is accurate. And with that, let's jump into the top 6 most nerfed guards in Smite since Season 1. What should come as no surprise for most of you is that most of these guards are older guards, but they aren't all necessarily released before Season 1. A guard that was released very early was number 6 though, and that is NEMESIS. NEMESIS was initially classified as a warrior and had some very different functionalities overall. She was actually released very broken. She had adjustments pre-Season 1 though, so we don't factor that in. What we will factor in are the changes beginning with patch 1.02106. Nice numbers back then. This one was when Retribution was changed. And Retribution was originally an ability that would shield all incoming damage while still reflecting it and also healing yourself. In this patch, Retribution got this complete damage immunity taken away. Instead, it was turned into a shield with 100 to 500 health. We got some smaller buffs in return as well, but those didn't really compete with the previous infinite damage shield for a short duration. After that, NEMESIS was reclassified from a warrior to an assassin and got a complete overhaul of her stats. And the first changes she received after being reclassified as an assassin were actually buffs. For example, to her retribution cooldown, to her ultimate cooldown, to how Scales of Fate work, and also to the protection steal of Divine Judgment. So in the beginning, things were looking up for her, and this was until Season 3, mid-Season 3 actually. Then NEMESIS just became a bit overwhelming, and she started receiving nerfs. First nerf here was in patch 3.17, where the cooldown of her ultimate was increased from 70 at all ranks to 90, scaling down to 70 across her ranks. The ultimate was still considered very strong, and one patch later, it got further nerfs. The damage was reduced from 30% to 50% of the target's current health to 20% to 40% of the target's current health, and the slow and movement speed reduction was decreased from 25% all ranks to 15, scaling up to 25. Even that heavy chunk out of her ultimate didn't make her disappear forever though. She had a little bit of a buff to her 1 to be able to use basics between the dashes, but then the nerfs continued. Patch 4.11, Scales of Fate get a reduced power gain and loss from 6% to 5%. In Smite patch 4.13, she then received some tweaks. She got damage buffs to Swift Vengeance and Slice and Dice, but the slow on Slice and Dice was reduced, whereas Divine Judgment's Protection Shred was reduced from 50% to 30%, making her focused on having better clear and ability pressure, but less damage coming from the ultimate. This shifted her once again, but her performance didn't really change all too much. She didn't receive further nerfs until patch 5.4, but here, once again, her ultimate was nerfed, with the duration being decreased for the self buff from 8 seconds to 5 seconds, and the cooldown being increased from 90 to 70 seconds to 90 seconds at all ranks. And still not enough nerfs for the ult, it seemed, so in 5.6 the damage from the ult was decreased from 20 to 40% to 20 to 30% of the target's current health. And then in 5.8, the part that was previously buffed, the slice and dice damage, was also reduced once again from 50 to 170 to 40 to 160, or rather 80 to 320 in the middle. After that, Nemesis has disappeared a little bit from the stage and has since only received a small buff to her retribution. And that brings us to god number 5. This one had a really rough start and was initially considered rather weak, and that was SERQET. She got various buffs after her release, but then eventually it was kind of obvious that she was overperforming a little bit. As such, she started getting small nerfs. In October 2014, still in Season 1, her ambush got a cooldown increase from 15 to 17 seconds. In November, her physical power scaling on Deathbane was reduced from 50% to 45% per hit, and the protection reduction was reduced from 20% to 15% for 3 seconds. Then in December, her Cobra's Kiss was also nerfed, with the madness duration going down from up to 2 seconds to up to 1.4 seconds. After this amount of tuning, she was considered okay for the most part, but in Season 3 she once again performed too well. Her base movement speed was reduced from 380 to 370, the cooldown on Deathbane was increased from 10 to 12 seconds, and the cooldown on Ambush was increased from 15 to 18 seconds. Now, if you've been paying attention, it's kind of strange because Amber's cooldown should have been 17 seconds at this point already, so I'm not sure if the other change actually didn't get through properly or if this was just wrong in the notes. This is just what I could find based on the backlog that still exists. After that, she actually turned out to be a little bit too weak, and for example, the nerf on the Deathbane was actually reverted. So for most of Season 3 and the beginning of Season 4, she was mostly receiving buffs for a while. That was until patch 4.8, where Hyris got fed up with tank SERQET just doing too well. Here, Catalyst was nerfed so that the bonus damage for 2 poisons was reduced from 15 to 10% of the target's maximum health, and the last breath damage was adjusted from 228 to 684 to 210 to 690. A little bit of a buff on the top end, but more of a nerf on the bottom end here, so overall more of a nerf. Then, in patch 5.3, Deathbane was once again nerfed and the cooldown was increased again from 10 seconds to this time 13 seconds. The protection reduction was also reduced from 15% to 10%. In 5.6, Last Breath was now nerfed so that SERQET would be damageable during the ultimate, and in 5.13, the Catalyst maximum damage for 3 poisons was reduced from 25% to 20%, and Last Breath was once again nerfed a little bit further to now down to 200 to 640 damage. Especially through a true damage, SERQET still remains a strong pick though. Number 4 on the list also received a total of 8 nerfs, but in addition to that also received a further tweak that included some nerfs, so it's slightly over SERQET. And that is Aquatic. Now Aquatic has gone through some very different phases, which explains the many nerfs that he got. Initially, shortly after his release in December 2014, he got a nerf to the magical power scaling of Dragon Call, as well as the range damage for throwing it. Here the base damage was decreased a little bit per number of dragons still available to you. Then in February, the Dragon Call damage got another drastic decrease. The magical scaling was actually increased from 28% to 30% again, so reverting that small nerf. However, the base damage of the ability was reduced from 40 to 120 per dragon to 30 to 90 per dragon, so we were losing 30 base damage at max rank per dragon, and that obviously is very, very impactful and was kind of the end of basic attack focused Aquatic for a while. Then he got a lot of buffs to kind of compensate for that later down the road, targeting other abilities primarily, but that kind of led to him being a bit too strong in the ability department, because that led to Aquatic being primarily played with Polynomicon and with an ability burster build. Therefore, in patch 2.11, Wildstorm would no longer proc Polynomicon at max casting range, but only at melee range. This would later be tackled even more, but we'll get to that. In patch 2.13 in September of 2015, Wildstorm received a further nerf, with the magical power scaling being reduced from 50% to 40% and the cooldown being increased from only 5 seconds to 7 seconds. Dragon Call, on the other hand, got a little bit of a base damage buff, not nearly as much as it used to be, but a little bit of the damage returned to focus him a little bit more in that direction. He also got further buffs in patch 3.1, focusing mostly on his base stats, but that again led to him being a little bit too potent later down the road. His water illusion was nerfed in patch 3.11, with the damage going down from 290 to 270, and the scaling being reduced from 70 to 60%. But even then, especially Wild Storm was strong, so in patch 3.12 he got a nerf to the base damage once again, going up to 290, now instead going up to 260. In 4.13, Ao Kuang's base stats received an overhaul, and he got a new passive. Patch 4.19, however, he got a few small buffs, with the ranged dragon damage being increased from 35 to 40 for Dragon Call, and Wildstorm getting a little bit of base damage from 260 up to 270. However, Wildstorm would no longer trigger basic attack items or effects. This essentially means that at this point you couldn't trigger Polynomicon with Wildstorm at all, and that was a drastic effect for Ao Kuang, because he was basically always built with Poly, otherwise it was his core item. Still, Ao Kuang was quite comfortable with his new identity, and he still required further nerfs. In patch 5.1, his ultimate was nerfed with a self-heal now only triggering once a target was executed and Ao Kuang had flown into the air, giving him a little bit of safety, and at 5.4, the ult was nerfed once again, removing the brief window where Ao Kuang is untargetable during the ability's casting time, making it a lot easier to get away from him or interrupt him. And then, in patch 5.5, Dragon Call was nerfed again. The ranged dragon's throw magical power scaling was decreased from 90% to 78%, or from 15% to 13% per dragon. That was his last nerf so far, but with his current place in the ranked meta, I would not be surprised to see further nerfs to Dragon Call in the future as well, especially the basic attack focused part. Number 3 on the list is actually completely interchangeable with Ao Kuang in their placement, and that is Freya. Both received a total of 1 tweaks, 4 buffs, and 8 nerfs, as well as 1 major or minor rekit or reclass or change of abilities. Freya's first nerf came in October 2014, with Valkyrie's Discretion having its radius reduced from 15 to 12 feet and the range being reduced from 65 to 55 feet. In November of the same year, Banish was changed so that enemies would fall back from the sky quicker after being banished. Then she got quite a few buffs in between, first being base stats that were changed and adjusted and increased, then her pulse having a longer duration, and then Banish having a longer duration in most situations as well. However, she did get nerfed again in patch 4.1. Here her ultimate was once again nerfed, with the base damage being decreased from 120 to 240 to 100 to 240. In patch 4.14 she got buffs to her attack speed, and the base damage of her pulse was increased. However, a lot of that was taken back in patch 4.15. The base attack speed went down from 1 to 0.95 again, and the pulse damage was decreased from 30 to 70 to 25 to 65. In patch 5.3, she also got changes to her passive, Brisingament's Blessing, being reduced from its total lifesteal just being 15% to 5% plus 0.5% per level, ending at 15%. This was at a time where the lifesteal on her just became too overwhelming, especially with new items. At the same time, Irradiate got a damage decrease from 40 to 100 to 35 to 95, and the scaling was reduced from 25% to 20% per shot. Then she got an overhaul to her kit that many of you are probably already familiar with from patch 5.13, after which she required some further adjustments. So in patch 5.14 she got a nerf to the Northern Lights damage from 60% to 50%, whereas her Aurora Blade got buffed a little bit and would have less mana cost. In patch 5.16 the base damage of Northern Lights was decreased to a maximum of 210, and in patch 5.17 the scaling of Northern Lights was reduced from 50% to 40%. Also she got a fix where she got too much healing beforehand. Then in patch 5.19, the movement speed of her was decreased from 375 to 370. Those nerfs definitely did not destroy Freya though, she's still very much a present pick. And that brings us to a god that definitely felt the impact of his nerfs a lot more. And this is probably the god that a lot of people expected to be number 1. And that is Khepri. Khepri had a total of 9 nerfs and a tweak that also included nerfs as well as 6 buffs. Now, Khepri's history starts with nerfs. In Smite patch 2.12, and keep in mind Khepri was not the earliest of the releases here by far, he got a ton of nerfs already. His Fortitude had its shield lowered, a Duct had its damage reduced, and Rising Dawn had its mitigation decreased. And then in patch 2.13, Rising Dawn had its mana cost increased from 40 at all ranks to 50 to 70. Interesting to go with that decision at the start. Solar Flare had its cooldown increased from 15 seconds to 18 seconds as well. In patch 2.14, Hi-Rez decided that Scarab's Blessing would no longer prevent enemies from executing targets, so executes would be a direct counter to it now. In patch 2.16, Rising Dawn had its cooldown increased from 10 to 12 seconds, so you can imagine how strong its ability was at the start. Also, Scarab's Blessing had the revived health decreased from 40 to 60% to 25 to 45%, so that people would be less able to fight after coming back. In patch 2.17, Rising Dawn had its mana cost increased even further from 50 to 70 to 50 to 90. And keep in mind, it started at 40. In patch 2.19, Rising Dawn's damage reduction was once again targeted after it's already been nerfed in the past. Now it went down from 20 to 40% to 10 to 30%. Also, Scarab's Blessing would no longer provide the target with power. In patch 3.1, Abduct had its pull duration reduced from 1.5 to 2.3 seconds to 1.5 to 1.9 seconds. In the same patch, Scarab's Blessing's range was reduced from 65 to 55, making it a little bit harder to revive your allies. Then in patch 3.5, Capri's base health was reduced from 510 to 460. Better nerf Capri. Shortly afterwards it was increased again to 490 by the way. Then patch 4.1, Capri received a buff to Solar Flare, got a little bit more damage here, but at the same time the cooldown of Scarab's Blessing was increased from 90 seconds to 110 seconds at all ranks. In patch 4.10, Rising Dawn had its damage reduced from 12 to 24 to 10 to 22 per tick. After that, Capri was actually finally relieved of his nerfs and has received quite a few buffs since. Still, he definitely hasn't found his strength or old place in the meta yet. And that brings us to the number one, the most nerfed god in Smite. Can you guess who it is? It is Ratatoskr. Ratatoskr had a total of 10 nerfs and a rekit and no buffs. He's the only god that has received 10 nerfs since the start of Season 1. After his release in patch 2.8, he got a ridiculous amount of changes across all of his abilities, reduced the scaling on various of them as well as decreasing the power he gets from acorns and such, which was at the time where he had multiple acorns to begin with. I'm not gonna go through all of them. If you want to read that up, feel free to. Then in patch 2.11, he also got a lot of heavy nerfs. The dart distance for his dash was decreased from 40 to 35 units, and he was now also limited to a maximum of 2 resets of the dart within 10 seconds for a maximum of 3 dashes in total, which was back when he could still dash through enemies, so no more dashing through the entire team almost forever. The ultimate through the Cosmos also got a small nerf, with the setup time being increased from 1 second to 1.5 seconds. But despite these nerfs, Ratatoskr couldn't really be balanced properly. He always had acorns that were too strong, others that were too weak or whatever. So what happened in 3.9 is that he received a complete overhaul. And with that, his abilities were changed and needed new adjustment. In patch 3.9, the cooldown of Acorn Blast was increased from 10 seconds to 15 seconds, so quite a drastic increase. In patch 3.10, Dart had its base damage decreased from up to 260 to 240. Flurry had its cooldown increased from 12 to 14 seconds, and the protection debuff was reduced from 2 to up to 6 to 2 to up to 4. In patch 3.11, so still shortly after that, the healing of Acorn of Yggdrasil was reduced from 20 to 15. The scaling was also reduced from 40 to 30%. In patch 3.12, so once again just one patch later, the HP per level was reduced from 75 to 73, and the damage of Acorn Blast was reduced from up to 110 to up to 100, with 10 sliced off each rank. In patch 3.14, so only 2 patches later once again, Acorn of Yggdrasil had the physical power scaling heal reduced from 30% to 15%, and remember, it was already nerfed before, and Dart has its physical damage decreased from 240 to 210, so another nerf here as well. The scaling was also reduced from 80% to 70%. After that, Ratatoskr had a few months of a break, but then in patch 4.3, the nerfs went on. Acorn of Yggdrasil had its cost increased from 500 to 700, And the dart had its cooldown reduction decreased from 2 seconds per flurry or Acon blast per god hit to 1 second. And Through the Cosmos also had its landing radius decreased from 25 to 20 units. After that, he got a little bit of a buff to flurry, which then in patch 5.1 again resulted in further nerfs, with the cooldown of dart being increased from 12 to 14 seconds and the mana cost for Acon Blast being increased from 60 at all ranks to 60 to 80. In patch 5.17, Through the Cosmos had its cooldown increased from 90 to 110, scaling down to 90 seconds. Now obviously what we have to keep in mind with Ratatoskr is he is still a decent pick right now, and also he was released completely broken, and even after his rework he was very strong. So while other gods often needed many of the nerfs to be adjusted to current metas, etc., with Ratatoskr it was just that he was such a strong release that nerfs needed to be done all the time, and not so much that the meta shifted things around him as much, though that is obviously still a factor. And that is it for the most nerf gods. This turned out a lot longer than I expected it to be, and we will look more into other things regarding gods in the future, like for example the most buffed, most changed, and other ones like the most balanced ones. So if you're interested in that, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. Those videos will come out in the near future. Other than that, thank you guys very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, I'd much appreciate a click of the like button, and also tell me in the comments if you expected these results or if you expected something completely different. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth out.